It's about time we
your
get
mother.
started. So yeah, without further ado, welcome, beautiful people, to the sixth, I believe, session of our Collective Courage book study with Dr. Jessica Gordon-Nemer. If this is your first time at a Kepler Institute event, then we're a nonprofit organization based in Indianapolis, Indiana, going 20 years strong. We're dedicated to building community wealth through social enterprise, youth leadership development, and community events just like the one we find ourselves at right now in this very moment. If you would like to, you can always go to Kepler.org to learn more about some of the initiatives we have going on. We have, quite a large breadth, I'm not gonna lie, quite a large breadth of work going on right now. And it's thanks to community members like yourselves that we can keep events like this free and accessible to the public. So we ask that you visit Kepler.org/donate to contribute. We take anything from a penny to $1 million if you happen to, be feeling gracious. We'd also like to thank the Indianapolis Recorder newspaper, the premier source of Indianapolis's African-American voices, aimed to empower and educate for over 125 years, for hosting this event on Facebook right now. And also, hello, Facebook people. I hope y'all are doing good. Hope y'all are having a good night. Very excited to have Dr. Jessica Gordon-Nemer with us tonight. She is a political columnist specializing in solidarity economy, community economics, Black political economy, and popular economic literacy. Her research and publications explore the African-American community through the lens of cooperative economic development, worker ownership, wealth inequality, and community-based asset building and approaches to justice. Her book, Collective Courage, A History of African-American Cooperative Economic Thought and Practice, takes an in-depth look into the socialized approaches of our predecessors. And we are here tonight to see how we can apply those same approaches today. So without further ado, I'm going to kick it off to Dr. Gordon-Nemer.
Good evening, everybody. It's such a pleasure to be here. I was saying this is one of the things I look forward to. I can't even say every week, every other week, right? So I'm really very happy to be here. Happy that you're back with us, and happy that we're going to be talking about one of my favorite organizations, the Young Negroes Cooperative League, Chapter 5 of Collective Courage. I will start, I don't know if I did it last time, but remembering to bring our ancestors into the room. We'll be bringing them in by some of the people we're actually talking about today in the Young Negroes Cooperative League, but also just in general, to bring them here with us because we stand on their shoulders. I also want to acknowledge the original stewards of the land, remind us that we are on stolen land and in colonial times still, even in the 21st century. So where are we in, I guess we're halfway through now, Collective Courage. Where have we come from? We talked about mutual aid and centuries of Black mutual aid on this continent. We talked about Black communal towns and utopian societies and what they accomplished and what their challenges were, the Maroon societies, where collectivism and self-determination were important. We talked about early efforts at joint stock ownership as a way to sort of democratize capital and have Black ownership, a little bit about Black capitalism. And then we mostly talked about the beginnings of cooperative ownership and the transition from sort of mutual aid to actual cooperative businesses. We also talked about one of my favorite periods, the 1880s, and how similar it is to now, and how important the populist movement was as combining labor, cooperative development, integration, women's rights, all into political parties, as well as cooperative development associations, and the struggles, even in one of the worst recessive periods of US politics, and how important the co-op movement was in that mix. And then we started to talk about early 20th century co-ops, and again, their development out of mutual aid and into officially recognized co-op businesses, and the importance of their connection with Black organizations and organizing and community and all those important things. If you want to, and then we started to move into themes. If you want to look more at the chronology of Black co-ops, don't forget the timeline in the back of the book. I didn't really remind people to look at that. since we've been going chapter by chapter, but pages 239 to 249, I tried to create year by year documentation from 1780 to 2012 of Black co-ops and other activities happening in the Black co-op movement. So that's a way to just see the whole chronology if you're interested. And then, as I said, we started to look at some themes, not just sort of the chronology of the movement toward 20th century co-op ownership, but themes. And last week, the last time we were together, we talked about education, the importance of education, all kinds of education to the co-op movement and to co-op businesses, and how important that most of the co-ops that I found started with some kind of study group and learning together, learning journeys, and then the importance of internal education as well as public education about co-ops for the community and for non-members. And you'll see the education stuff comes up all the time. It's going to come up in chapter 5 when we talk about Young Negroes Cooperative League. It's going to come up when we talk about role of women. It's going to come up when we talk about the commonalities and the themes throughout the Black co-op movement in the last chapter. But we kind of place the education chapter toward the middle of the book because there were so many important education things that happened around the 1930s, which is around the middle period of what we're studying. And so then we started to talk about the 1930s. We're going to talk about them more next time, also in chapter 6. But let's think about the 1930s. Stock market failure, right? Starting in 1929. Bank holidays, so people can't even get their money out of the bank if they had any. Skyrocketing unemployment, businesses are failing, people are committing suicide. Unemployment is as high for whites as it used to be for Blacks, and now it's skyrocketed, just incredibly high unemployment rates for Blacks and people of color. Sound like anything we know? Like maybe our period right now? And in 1930, a young, or I guess he's a middle-aged, no, I guess he's still sort of young, under 30, maybe around 30, a young columnist for the Black-owned Pittsburgh Courier, which is one of the major Black newspapers during its time, puts out one of his columns. He writes an appeal to young Negroes and subsequently creates a pamphlet with much of the same information. And what does he say? He says, "Young Negroes, it is you who must now take up the burden of leadership. You must succeed where the oldsters have failed. Young Negroes, turn your backs on the old programs and prescriptions and formulate others more in accord with the social and economic trends. Forget your petty individual interests and join in a cooperative effort for the betterment of all. Young Negroes, through cooperative effort as consumers, you can find your way out of the present dilemma. Collectively, through democratic management of your own economic enterprises, you can supply yourselves with everything you consume, your own amusement and recreation, your own education and culture." And that's George Schuyler in his column in the Pittsburgh Courier in 1930. So why do you think he was saying young Black people should be at the forefront of a new cooperative movement?
Well, I'm thinking that it was the young Black people who he was saying, but in the speeches that came down after AP finally called it the Biden, I had no idea that it was Black women, and of course it was, who did all that organizing. And the number of commentators, Black and white, and Joe and Kamala saying that Black people came together, organized, and did this, because if it hadn't been for that great push. And so when the young man was saying young Negroes, it was, I think it's a call to a Black collective. And It's like, you know, don't wait for others to show you the way. We can do this. And why he felt that there were no collectives anywhere that he could point to. Um, the way he said, forget about the old path, because, you know, a lot of times Black people who have want to keep, they're not about putting jeopardy in their fine homes or their great jobs. And so they won't step out there for the collective. So I can see how the resentment in a young person who says, like young people today, the whole nation is going to hell in a handbasket. What will there be? What will there be? So I can see this youngster saying, you know, we're too bright and too wonderful to just roll over and let this happen to us. We can get this done for us.
And I think you bring up an
Is
interesting
someone else?
point. Oh, I was gonna say, I think you bring up an interesting point because if I'm not mistaken, wasn't the author of this, you know, weren't they getting up there in their years? Like most of the vanguards of the cooperative movement early on, you know, after slavery had been ended, you know, a lot of these thinkers had kind of been reaching their prime, if not, you know, perhaps a little bit past. So I think they were calling out to young people because they're starting to see that, you know, like Ms. Fair said, there's going to be a long-term plan here, or there has to be a long-term plan here. And the only way you can really implement those kinds of plans is with young people, essentially. You know, if you don't got the young people on your side, that's a lot of, you know, activity and movement based into a person. I mean, we got all kinds of free time. So why not dedicate it to, you know, a cooperative effort, right?
Well, when you think about 1880 to 1930 is right at 50 years. And so if a youngster was like 10, 15 years old in 1880 and saw the flip and saw what happened in the South at 1880 when the troops got pulled out and Ku Klux Klan and Jim Crow took a mighty steep climb, then that would mean those people in 1930 were right at 70 years old, you know, 75, and maybe they were looking around for to inspire young people, Jeru, as you said.
Right. Or the young people might feel like those people were too scared, right? Because they had lived through all this repression and were too scared to do something, and it was their turn to take on something else, you know. And Jeru, you're right. George Schuyler, he's a columnist for the Pittsburgh Courier, so he's probably 35 or 40 by this time. He had been involved with A. Philip Randolph in the 20s with the Messenger magazine. So he's not real young. He's getting older and he's feeling like, right, there's an impasse, nothing's happening. And so he's appealing to young people to get more involved. And one of the people, you know, that comes right along with him is Ella Jo Baker. They both live down the street from each other in Harlem. I never figured out how they met. And it's interesting that he's a Pittsburgh Courier columnist, but he lives in Harlem, not in Pittsburgh, but maybe he lived in Pittsburgh once, or maybe it didn't matter that he lived in Pittsburgh. But anyway, he's in Harlem. And so, you know, but he's saying young people need to take leadership here, right? We need new blood, new ideas, and we need something in the long term, right? So the younger generation needs to usher it in so they can carry it through. The other really interesting thing about Schuyler is by the 40s, he's considered a raving Black conservative. So I, you know, and I haven't been able to read up enough about him to figure out when he made that change. But by the 40s, anything you ever hear about him is all about how conservative he is. And sort of I don't know. Anyway, he's right.
So
he's given up. He gives up his co-op stuff. Go ahead.
So when you say conservative, are you saying he moved away from the idea of cooperatives by the 40s?
Yes. So he doesn't promote cooperativism anymore. He isn't really in the civil rights movement anymore. And, you know, when he worked with A. Philip Randolph in the 1920s, that was the Black Socialist Party and their newspaper. He was a co-editor with Randolph of the the Messenger. So he's not a socialist. He's not a cooperative person, and not person. You know, he's not in the cooperative movement anymore. And then he's not really in the civil rights movement. He's kind of, I don't know what you would call him. I guess he becomes sort of a cultural nationalist. So he's not totally conservative, right? He more believes in, you know, Black separatism for cultural reasons, but he's not really doing anything to transform society. He's kind of hunkered down. He thinks everybody's a mess, right? And anyway, so it's really interesting. It's hard for me to believe when you read his whole appeal that I was just quoting from, to read, you know, within 10 years, someone who's gone so totally against his own words. But you know what? We have to deal with people where they are. And I use him in the Young Negroes Cooperative League. I haven't been able to figure out that much more about his life and didn't really want to put that much time into it. And so, but it is curious. It's again, those things, right? The tensions and the contradictions in life, right? And how people move and change over time.
Do you think that this getting burned is a statement, but you know, all the fight and all the trying to bring people together, and I think when you've decided, oh, I'm going to help community, oh, I'm going to go out and engage community, and we're just going to do wonderful things. You have to know why you're going out there. Because if you're going out there so you can do good things for somebody else, you better check on you. You're going out there to engage them to do good things for all of us. And when you put yourself out there like that, and you get rejected when you start going out saying, hey, I got the answer, come on and help me do what I think is the answer. And you look behind you and there's nobody back there that's working with you, because you're the one that said that you got all the answers. And so I think that a lot of times, especially, you know, when you've got a great thought and you've looked at it and you know how this can work, to slow yourself down enough to work with community for community improvement. And that is going to take some time. And I'm thinking that he just could have got a burnout.
He might have gotten burned out. Right. I mean, the interesting contrast is his partner, Ella Jo Baker, and the opposite happened to her, right? She kept moving. She actually stayed in the co-op world. She did other co-op stuff in Harlem. She then, you know, she worked for the WPA, doing education through the Works Progress. Then she joined the NACP and was field director there. Then she started the SCLC with King. Then she started SNCC with the young people again. You know, she just kept moving, learning and moving and bringing what she learned to the next movement. So a very different, what is that, personality and style than Skylar, right? So she was in it for the long haul, and she kept moving, kept learning, moving, and you know, bringing ideas and knowledge to new movements and to different efforts. And that's how she handled things. So yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah, you know, and I'm thinking that, you know, my last statement on it, but I'm just thinking that, you know, like they talked to a couple of the Black women organizers, especially in Philly. Man, that Philly is just, I mean, Pittsburgh. I mean, Black people have been doing it there pushing for a while. But, and, you know, and why not in Philadelphia, the place with the Liberty Bell, make white people mean it. Yes, this is for all of us, liberty. But, you know, I think it's that tenacity with, it didn't work this way. What happens in community happens to me.
Right.
It's not working this way, then let's see if I can get it to work this way.
We'll try what else. Yep. And just keep moving with it.
Just keep moving. And somebody is starting a program. Go ahead.
No, I was just saying, I was just curious if any of the young people have any thoughts about, you know, the Ella Jo Baker and Shira and the Young Negro Cooperative League.
Good question.
Kenneth, you
I
young,
know.
you're not but 50.
He doesn't get to go yet. He's going to be a responder in a minute. I'm going to call on the responder.
Okay. All right, Pedro, where are you in there? You're only 50 also. You're young.
What about 20 and 30-year-olds?
That's not 50 is not young anymore.
Oh, okay.
Thank you.
You speak for yourself, Kenneth. You speak for
No,
yourself.
no,
Yes,
you
yes.
too. Nope.
Okay,
But go
Mimi.
ahead.
Okay, Mimi, how about you and Casman? Come on now, what are y'all thinking?
I can go. Yeah, I mean, Ella Jo Baker is definitely super inspirational. Clearly a person with a lot of clarity and grit to just keep learning and stay committed forever. That's amazing. It's interesting because Aguila was just telling me the other day that apparently Clarence Thomas, when he was younger, had some more radical perspectives and times. I think that's really interesting.
Wait, was that me?
Yeah, that was you.
I don't recall this.
And there was some theories about that. Okay, anyways. I'll get back with you later about
About how he got burned out, huh?
Well, actually, she was telling me about some theory that he's like actually still has that perspective deep inside, but he's like working to make things as bad as possible because that's what he thinks it will take.
That wasn't me.
Oh God, no. Oh no.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
Isn't it interesting?
There's a podcast on the media podcast about the Black nationalism of Clarence Thomas.
There we go. Was that you, Alvin?
Yeah, I told you about it.
You mixed up the Asians?
Yeah,
The
Asian delegation. So that's interesting, but I mean, as far as like why, we can only guess, but I could see, what Mrs. Fair said as far as a sense of burnout with the challenges, and also like, just experiencing traumas, and yeah, I mean, you got also like this dominant culture of course, white supremacy, but connected to that as well, individualism, and these things that I think as far as like an individualistic lifestyle, it has its appeals for sure, and it seems easier, and it's not pushing against the current, and the current is always there. So the clarity, the determination, the grit to continue to pursue your vision, with a number of people that continues to be the minority, just that takes so much. So I can see how those things would impact his path. I also really liked, there's this part that you put on page 121, where it says, God, let me find it. I'm trying to work this Kindle, and I'm not a real millennial. Okay, so it says, leaders and members of the YNCL clearly understood that cooperative economics was a strategy in pursuit of a larger goal, the elimination of economic exploitation and the transition to a new social order. And I just love that so much, because, it's a lot of things that it entails doing the work, and I think you have to have that vision and clarity about why. What is it all about? What do you do it for? And that's the big why, because you envision a completely different way of being in the world, and you keep your eyes on the prize about all of these things that we do, all this work that we put in, is for that world that we're trying to create, not, it has these smaller manifestations, which has, everything has its intricacy, its nuance, its challenges, ups and downs, but they're all pieces of this much bigger, broader goal and vision that you're working towards, So I just loved how you summarized that right there.
Oh, thank you. Thanks. One more
Jasmine, were
young
you gonna
person?
I have to present, but if you want me to talk more than once, I sure can.
Oh, I was going to call on the presenters in 1 minute. Is there anybody, any other young person who just wants to talk in general about the notion of young people of color kind of being at the forefront of a new movement?
Part of me.
I can.
Oh no, go for it, Aguila.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I thought it was just really interesting kind of tracing the history of young people and youth and like liberation movements. And I think the core of the importance of like intergenerational work and like, the ethos of like sustainability is rooted in an intergenerational approach because you have, like the push for progress, I think often comes from young people. It's not just solely limited to them. But it just reminded me, of looking at the history of like, the Black Panthers, the Young Lords, the various, I think, movements that have been led by young people, a lot of student organizing, and, how we see that today. But I think what is often missing from that narrative is the importance of that intergenerational piece of like, how do you bridge these, like, quote unquote, like generational divides. And, as a millennial, oftentimes, the narrative, and this always happens, I feel, with like whatever generation. I don't think it's just unique to this moment in time, but of like, this tension between elders and young people. And I think it's just been accelerated of like this divide between like, oh, millennials versus boomers, like millennials and Gen Z versus boomers, and kind of this, I think, often reduction in that, which I don't think is how our communities always function. I think the importance of the wisdom of elders is often divorced from these contexts, and I don't want to say almost like a fetishization of youth activism, but kind of like a very hyper focused, expecting young people to be the one to change the world solely on them. So I'm thinking of like the youth climate strikes and this narrative of like, the young people are going to save us, but it's like, well, no, it's a collective effort. And, that we always should center young people, and it's important to invest in their leadership and development. But that doesn't happen in a vacuum. That happens within a community, within different ages and different, perspectives and worldviews. And, there's a lot to learn from those who have come before us, but the world is always changing. And so it's also important to root that perspective of young people in that. And, we always talk about the creative tension that comes from it, of like, the importance of learning, but then also forging your own path. So I definitely, saw that reflected in this chapter. And, the legacies of cooperatives continuing. And again, this importance of like sustainability is rooted in that intergenerational approach.
Great, thanks. Okay, now how about Casman, your overall reflections on the chapter?
So I really liked the chapter a lot. Especially right now, I know we've talked about it, but just with the election and thinking about the power and the tenacity and perseverance of Black women, and learning about Ella Jo Baker just kind of emphasized that for me and made me feel very proud. So I really like that part. But I had like some quotes that I thought were interesting too. And George Schuyler, I really liked how they focused a lot on education to support good business practice. But I thought about it in terms of ethics, because I have friends that are in business school, and I think about the kind of education that they receive compared to what kind of education you would receive when you're learning about cooperative economics. So it's not just about making money, obviously, but it's about being ethical to those you serve. And I thought that education would be a really important part to recruit people as well. And I think Mimi said this about individualism. That was kind of the thing that I kept coming back to as I read it, because I felt like, especially now where we have, obviously inequality was extreme back then, but thinking about the fact that inequality between Black people and white people now is the highest that it's been since the 1970s. Like, we're worse off since then. And thinking about how, because of that, our culture, even Black culture as well, we're really focused on luxury and what we can own and individualism and how we look like we have more money, even though we really don't. And I thought, how would you counteract that now with education? How would you reach out to young people to say, you don't need to own, I can't think of these bags that everybody's wearing right now, but you don't need to own this purse. This will be a better way to spend your money, and this would be more lucrative, and having the dollar turn around this many times in the Black community will have this impact on you and your family and the people you know. And thinking about how we can address that, especially in a society where we look a lot at social media and Instagram and things that are not real. How do you say this is bad and this is good, or not bad, but this is better for you than that? So I just kept thinking about that throughout. I really liked Ella Jo Baker when she talked about the don't buy where you can't work, like campaigns. I thought that was so smart. But again, that goes back to the same thing about, if we're looking at the American dream and individualism, the ability to shop somewhere or buy something that others that look like you can't, you get that feeling of elitism. And how do you challenge that, especially in young people? And young people, I read this book, and I cannot remember which book it was, but it talked about how people who are in college, young people of all races, are going to college, but they're getting degrees in like finance and engineering and things like that. And there's no one who's interested in liberal arts because they don't think they can make money. And so what happens to society when you don't have people who go to school to learn about that, or who want to be engaged in cooperative economics and things like that? Society crumbles because everyone is thinking about themselves. And we're encouraging it. I mean, you get to feel like you're better than other people. And there's research that shows that too, where they say you can make $200,000 a year, but your neighbor is going to make, $300,000. Do you want that? Or would you rather make $10,000 and your neighbor makes $5,000? And everyone wants to just make way more than their neighbor. It doesn't matter if they're better off. So I just think about all those kinds of things and how you would counteract it. And sorry, let me know if I'm talking too fast too, as I get real. I wrote a lot of stuff down. I liked too where we were talking about how do you identify with the collective? And that goes back to the same thing. I think Black women, because of our experience with multiple forms of oppression, I think that it's easier, and I might be biased, but I do think it's easier to identify with it and say, even though your experience is different than mine, and I might not have the same type of issue, I think we need to address it. And I'm married, my husband's Mexican, so he thinks about Mexican people and their experiences. But when I say, oh, we should donate to X, Y, and Z, or we should do that, he's like, no, we need to keep our money for ourselves. And he grew up really poor. So his mind is so much about like a scarcity mindset, and we have to keep it to ourselves. And that's another thing. How do you counteract that and encourage people to give? But then at the same time, when you get into churches, we think about tithing. And in my family, my mom spends her money in ways that I don't agree with, but she makes sure that she pays her tithes before she does anything else. And I think about what that means and how that looks. So like in the white community, if you give money to organizations, you're a philanthropist. But as a Black person who tithes and you give money to your church or whatever organizations here and there, no one calls you a philanthropist. Like, you're just a person and you give some money. And there's a dollar amount to where you are a philanthropist as well. So I think about that in terms of the collective. When you talked about the Buffalo, and I can't think of the whole name, but the Buffalo Cooperative, and how people, like a small group of people with means, paid money to keep it in, afloat. And they probably didn't need to. Obviously, if they had the means to do that, they could have shopped elsewhere and they could have been in these different circles where they felt elite, but they thought it was important to save, that grocery store. And how do you do that? How do you make people feel that attachment to, a larger group, and that we don't necessarily look like? And I think that Skylar said that at first. I think that was a part of it. I think actually it was Ella Jo Baker, who said we need to avoid elitism. And educated Black people have a hard time doing that. It's something that you constantly have to address in yourself when you're looking at people who are, I have to challenge it myself. Like I really like to fine dining. So me and my sister go out to fancy restaurants, but then it's like, do I need to dress up? Do I need to look a certain way to be welcome in this space? And I'm like, no, I can eat here no matter what I look like, because other people do that. White people do that. They go in however they want to. But if I saw some other Black people and they were like loud or crazy, like, oh, we do this whole, it's your fault. It's, if anything bad happens among Black people, it's every Black person's fault. And we all take that responsibility. And I think that's like people who are older than me, that especially like really wealthy and successful Black people that I know who are older than me, they really do that. Like that's a strong, strong thing. If I don't look a certain way when I meet with them, then they're like, oh, you need to wear a dress and you need to straighten your hair. Or they're like very, I don't know, very much about respectability. And I think that because our society encourages that, even as a young Black person who knows, that's ridiculous and I shouldn't do that, you have to constantly challenge yourself to say, no, and this is why. Every form of Black is good, whether you're rich or poor or in the middle. And I just feel like the way that you were writing about it just made me think about this a lot more, and about the myth of the American dream, and about how we can't, it's not something that is available to really, immigrants have the ability to do it a lot more often than like native born African-American people. And I think that that's an interesting thing. And what are the causes for that? And I don't know if enough people are addressing it, but overall, the American dream is pretty much out of reach. So how do we say, what is our dream then? What are we trying to strive for and reach if that's not it? And if it hasn't been working for us, and it hasn't up until now. So I'm sorry if I just was rambling, but I got really excited. And thank you for the chapter. I really enjoyed it.
You're welcome. And you weren't rambling. That's really important ideas and thoughts. And I'm glad for you to make those associations, right, between what you were reading and what's happening now and that kind of thing. Does anyone want to comment on anything Casman said or brought up?
I really like the messaging about the elitism from Ella Jo Baker as well as something I had written down, because I think there does tend to be elitism in the field of like scholarship and like in scholarly writing, and just how people go about educating somebody to somebody who doesn't know. And it's interesting to me because a lot of people don't realize that at one point they didn't know things, and it sounds funny to say, but people aren't just born with certain like inalienable knowledge. A lot of things are taught. So you have to really break it down to a fundamental level and think, this person doesn't know, and that's okay that they don't know, and be able to bring it to them and not look down on them for not knowing or not understanding a certain concept. That in particular is really important to me.
I'll say that for me, Em and I were having a conversation, and the question about, I guess, challenging the mindset, the people who in the Buffalo Cooperative, I guess the 10 families that put in their own money, and obviously like Casman well off, but they felt committed to try to keep it going. And so, the question became, and I know, because of economic conditions, people had less money. But to me, the question is, again, what will it take for us to be committed enough to say that, even when things improve, that we still need to build our own economic base, that we still need to create our own businesses, that we still need to support them, even if we can go other places to consciously do that. And so, I don't know, what that will take in the concept of this, like they said, this idea of being an American and, I can support these other businesses, but not really thinking a lot about when you support those businesses supporting your community or allowing you to employ people within your community and to build wealth so that you can thrive. And so, I think, we do practice mutual aid and those kind of things. But then when it comes to the economics of businesses, I feel like, it's going to take a lot to change our mindset about, first and foremost, when we think about spending money, and even like now, I've been trying to practice it, but, it is just a lot easier to go with existing systems that already exist that may not necessarily serve the community. So like, for instance, I think I read something about Amazon and it said that, they were supporting prison systems and things like that. So I said, okay, I'm gonna try as much as I can not to buy stuff from Amazon. I'm gonna buy from other people, and be committed to it, and then to get community. And especially when you have little resources and you can go to Walmart and get something much, much more cheaper maybe than if you don't have a cooperative where you can put in your money and get it for cheaper. People is like, okay, I'm gonna stretch my dollar, or, I need this right now. So I don't know, how we get to a point where we have enough, I guess you would say, awareness about the need to really try to pool our money. But again, I think you start small, and then hopefully, as you start small and you work with people and it grows, and it seemed like, what you chronicle was each time they were much more successful and lasted longer. So you just have to remember that it is for the long haul, and that whatever effort we take is building on the other one, and how can we move it that much further down the line?
Sorry, I was trying to get off mute. Yeah, great points, everybody. And remember, I think it was last time when we were talking about education, we were also talking about, right, education doesn't necessarily mean elite formal training. It's about learning together and the importance of learning together. And that was one of the things I also really liked about sort of the co-op system. It's not really about who has better or more knowledge and who's the right. It's about everybody contributing knowledge and learning together to make the whole movement better. And then Pambana, what you were saying about, how do we do it, right? The starting small. And I'm gonna actually let Kenneth go, but then I'll get back to, I wanted to end tonight by talking about the Young Negroes Cooperative League's 5-year plan or whatever it was. I guess it was 5 years. But anyway, they definitely had a plan about starting small and building on each other and building, which is another reason why I was so excited about that organization. And so I was going to have us end by talking about whether we think that kind of a strategy will still work today. So I'll get back to that, but I want to make sure Kenneth gets his turn. Kenneth?
Can I share my screen? Can you allow me to share my screen? Can you give me authority to use my screen? That's what I'm asking you.
I think Trey can.
Yeah. Trey, right? I was trying to think of who it is between Jeru, Trey, and Alvin, but
looks like you're co-host now. You should be able to do it now.
Okay. All right, can you guys see my screen here?
Yeah.
There you go. Good to go.
Let's see. All right. Thank you for allowing me to do this. So this is a pleasure for me to do this. I started last week and I finished up today. So I was just doing it in parts. So this is the Collective Courage Chapter 5 overview. I think that's what you asked me to do, and then give some reflection. So I think some of the, there it is, all right. So the first part, so I divided it up by sections. So I'm gonna go over this just overview, and then I'll give you just a few comments here. But I divided it up by sections: the Young Negroes Cooperative League, connection to other Black organizations, the Yellow Baker and the legacy, and then a short but productive life, and then what this means, which would be the reflection. So that's kind of like the 5 or 6 parts that I wanted to focus on in your book that I felt were the major sections in your text. So beginning with, and I got these pictures online that were respective of the time. Like these pictures actually came from the Young Negroes Cooperative League. So they're represented directly from that source. And so is the Black organization, this picture too. Anyway, the YNCL pamphlet distributed by Schuler outlined the goals of the organization, delineating the response. So what this one is about, because I'm going to try not to read to you, is that on pages 113 through 114, they talked about getting young people involved, which was the most important thing for YNCL. It's called the Young Negroes Cooperative League, obviously, so you want to get young African Americans involved. But they were saying how that was so important because they were essentially the cornerstone besides Black women that made this movement happen. So they reached out to them directly in order for the YNCL to work. And this is important because later in the text, it says, just give me 1 second. I think it's on page 122, 120. Anyway, I don't know where it is right now, but it's somewhere in the text. And I probably will come to it at some point. But Ella Baker, who is later in charge of SNCC, says it was her, and that's mostly young people too, that it was because of her actions with the YNCL that made her productive with SNCC. So this was a beginning process for her, and it worked. It worked for 3 years at least, and then that set up a future sort of model for her. And then moving on to the connection to other Black organizations. I'm sorry, before I move on, I wanted to give you guys a quote on page 113. It says the Young Negroes Cooperative League was established in December of 1930. So I wanted to give you a date there. The YNCL is not usually mentioned among Black leaders in Black history texts or in African American scholarship in general, except in the comprehensive biographies of Ella Jo Baker. So it's not usually known, but it was a big part of her life. And it was the impetus of a lot of the things that we do now. Moving on to the connection to other Black organizations, Schuyler, I think I spelled that correctly, I'm not sure. And Baker and others connected with A. Philip Randolph, who I think managed, he was the guy in charge of he was the leader of Pullman Porters Association and the NAACP. Philip Randolph was essential person in the civil rights movement. He was connected to King, among others, and then they were able to connect him, Schuler and Baker. They were both able to connect with Philip Randolph and the NAACP later on, and that's on page 115. And I wanted to read something related to that as well, page 116. On page 116, under consolidation in 1932, by 1932, the YNCL had formed councils in New York, Philly, Pittsburgh, Columbus, Cleveland, Phoenix, New Orleans, Columbia, Portsmouth, Washington, D.C., and other places. And the reason why I wanted to read that to you guys is because the organization was growing quickly and it was doing a lot of things. and it was growing in major cities. So it was catching on and people were finding its significance. It's unfortunate, and I didn't get to it. Maybe she talks about it now or in the next chapter, but it seems as if they were doing very well, YNCL, and I'm not exactly sure what happened. I think what was suggested was I think it was the Great Depression, because that was discussed a few times toward the end of the text, that it was very difficult to get members involved in the collective and paying dues because of the Great Depression. And so while this was effective to some degree during the Great Depression, because we were collecting our resources together, it was also difficult to pay dues, as I said, because they just couldn't afford it. And that may be the reason why, and maybe the professor will enlighten me on this later on why it dissolved later on. But it seemed to be going great, and then something happened. Ella Baker, and this is the next section of the text. We talk about Ella Baker, and she was like monumental. She was a big deal for the YNCL. She's kind of, her and Schuler are the faces of the organization. And she, as I said before, she used her experience with YNCL to grow other movements as well. The quote here says, Black leadership had to be emphasized and poor people's voices amplified, because in absolutely every other facet of social life and opposite pressures and privileges in force. And what this means is that they had to do something now because there were too many outside pressures interfering, or at least that's how I read it. But that if Black leadership, including Black youth, and in particular Black women, that it was up to them to change the trajectory of Black folks, right? And nothing else, that it was their responsibility. You know, and we talked about the voter, we talked about what, I wanted to share this with you guys. We talked about the effect of the Black women vote today, which was very significant. And that was their vote, and their voice was as powerful as it is today as it was then. And I got this from my sources, Center for American Progress. I think it's .org. And this is the part I wanted to read to you guys. In 2008 or 2012, turnout levels were replicated in 2020. Black women would cast at least 1 million more ballots than they did in 2016, reaching a total of roughly 11 million votes. Their votes and their voice counted. It made a change. It helped to elect the president and vice president that we have now. And even then, as I said, back then, Ella Baker knew, I don't know how she knew, but she knew then that Black women would be sort of the carriers of the movement, and they were then and now. Moving on, but it was one other thing I wanted to read to you guys about Ella Baker in the book on page 120 and then 122, and I'm almost done here. On 120, toward the top of the paragraph, it says, according to Ransby, the YNCL experiment foreshadowed Baker's philosophy and strategy in forming and advising SNCC 30 years later, as I said earlier. Both organizations were independent of the modern mainstream, Black organizations of their times, and focused on grassroots leadership, education, democratic decision-making, and a step-by-step transformative process of working toward long-term goals. So they had a plan. She had a plan on how not just to lead, but how to grow an organization. A lot of times we have great ideas, but we don't know how to grow an organization. And she did this twice. And then the other thing I wanted to, 122, on page 122. It's toward the bottom of the page. The Citizens Cooperative Society of Buffalo, New York was established in 1928 to afford Blacks of Buffalo an opportunity to help themselves and improve their standard of living through collective work and responsibility. And all I wanted to show there was that, because I wrote a pattern of growth, that they were intentionally growing this process of believing in collectivity, of coming together as a community, that this is a pattern of people thinking in the same way, not just in one community, but throughout the country. And I thought that was very interesting. And then on the next page, 123, it said the co-op grocery had financial problems from the beginning, since it was started during the Great Depression and unemployment was high in Buffalo. And it had, and so there were some problems with this. The grocery store, there were some problems there. There were problems with the dues. So it wasn't quite easy for them. But the reason why I wanted to point that out was because, wow, that's pretty amazing that you can still have the state of mind to think collectively and to bring in your resources in the middle of a depression. It actually makes sense. But I think a lot of times people are thinking, you know, I need to take care of my family first, right? And not really share what little I have with others and make that even bigger. And she had the wherewithal to think in terms of, you know, we need to think collectively rather than individually, because if we do so, then it will become worse for us. And then the last two parts are short but productive life. As I said before, it lasted about 3 years, but there were many things that came out of it. And the book describes some of the products of the YNCL that continue to impact us today. And then the last part, what this means to us. I just said sharing the product and other elements of YNCL efforts means the success of Black men, women, and their children. It means, as we have discussed before, establishing a power that allows us to negotiate for more and better opportunities in the whole of America. So the textbook, this section talks about how young people and women made a key role in establishing this collective idea, right? So that's what this text was mostly about. But I think by extension, it's also discussing how in order for us to get more from this country, I think it's important first for us to have this collective sense of belonging and sharing. And that way we empower ourselves economically and even emotionally and culturally. And then we have more to kind of wage and negotiate in the outside world. And maybe that's why Black women have such a strong voice, is because, and this is just conjecture, but maybe because Black women have a better sense of community. And again, that's just one person's opinion, my opinion, that's why they do so well in terms of voting and leading the discussion about how America should be, because they have a better sense of unity among themselves. There's more discussion, there's more sharing, there's more being together. And because of that, that might make an effect on the voting. And that's all that I have. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kenneth. That was really helpful, really nice. Anybody have any comments before I give mine? Comments or questions for Kenneth?
I definitely agree that it's going to have to come down to us holding, you know, some sort of collective culture before we can really try to, you know, attack the greater power of, you know, systemic capitalism. That's, I feel, a little bit more than, you know, any individual person or even, you know, fairly large group can handle all on its own.
I was going to ask Mrs. Fair, what grade you give Kenneth?
Don't do that, please.
No, that's what she was thinking. He was thinking the whole time. It's like, I better have my presentation ready.
Yeah. Don't do that, please.
It's wonderful.
Paulette doesn't pass fail, and any real critical remarks we made offline.
She will. She will. I I wanted to add one thing though, that it was, as I said before, that you made well, the text says that how Black women had a pivotal role in the guidance of YNCL among other cooperative organizations. And I said how that still impacts us today. Here's what I want to say is that yes, that is true altogether. And I think that Black men ought to do better. And I was kind of jealous today. You know, I was hearing a lot of things about Black women doing this and doing that. And you know, I love it. I love it. But I'm like, dang, I wish that more of, I don't know what that story does to us as Black males as well. You know, I was reading that what is it, the mass incarceration by Michelle Williams. And she said one of the major problems with Black women, if they choose to date and marry Black men, is that there aren't many of us out there, or it's very difficult for them to find the kind of man that they want because it's a good chance that they have a criminal record. And that's not to be negative. That's just, 1 in 3 Black men have some kind of criminal record, right? That's just a reality. And so because of that, it's kind of difficult for them to find economic equality among Black men. And not to say that they should marry Black men exclusively, but I'm saying if they choose to, there's a hardship there because of mass incarceration. And I was thinking about that today, and I was thinking that, damn, I think that we might have been able to contribute as much as Black women if we hadn't been if police haven't focused on us so much, if we haven't been profiled as much, if we didn't have the records that we have, I think that we might be as powerful as Black women. And not in the same way, but I think that it's very possible if we didn't have the kind of criminal sort of background that was perpetrated on us by whites, or white males in particular, that we might have as much to contribute as Black females.
Well, I think the challenge here is patriarchy, that Black men do contribute, and maybe not always in the economic lens. And the challenge often for Black men when they are contributing, maybe a lot of times more than Black women, is our inabilities to be patriarchal and defining our manhood through just purely an economic lens. And I think that's more of an issue for Black men than it is for Black women, because Black women get it often that you're not going to get ready to go out here and compete in economic space the same way. But there are other ways to contribute to community building, and we see it in our own fans, our own communities. So part of the challenge is, and I'm good with criminality. I don't endorse it, but the biggest criminals are those with all the money. And that's the biggest, opiate drug abuse, that was legalized dope selling. That's now got a lot of communities torn up. Ain't none of them guys going to jail. Ain't none of them guys going to go to jail. So the idea of who's the criminal, we just need to redefine what criminality looks like. I'm not advocating for us to go out and do stuff that ends up getting us locked up. But I think as Black men, we need to embrace and support Black women who are always, this ain't new, from the beginning, have always stepped into the space of making sure that their communities and families are strong. And then lastly, as Black men, we need to redefine what it means to be a contributor in our communities. Because white men ain't gonna have you guys up in there doing what they do. I don't care how smart you are or how many degrees you got. Go pick that mop over, boy. Mop the floor. Be right back.
Well, I'm not picking up no mop, but I see what you're saying. But yeah, I'll let you go, Professor. Thank you for your time. I'm just, my only comment is that I think that we would contribute and be as powerful as Black women, if not for so-called criminality, that I agree with him that it's, whatever. And the other thing, I think that we're still impacted. I don't want to say greater than Black women, but I think that we are impacted still through slavery and that slave mentality too, that talks about, what a man ought to be in power and that stuff. Anyway, thank you for your time.
Candace, I like what you said too. I'm so sorry. I just have one more comment because that's like my area. And I agree with definitely something that I have been talking about a lot lately is patriarchy, and that patriarchy wins out over race like 90% of the time. So some of you know this, but my mom and husband are police officers. So my mom, as a Black woman police officer, has a super difficult time. And she's a sassy Black woman too, like me. She's very opinionated. So that's even more. So my husband is Mexican. He's a person of color, but he can still identify with the white males in those spaces and get by and get benefits. And when we try to talk to him about these things, it takes him so much time and effort to have to say, oh, no, it's not because I'm just nicer or people like me, I'm charismatic. No, it's because of patriarchy. And so I do think that that's something that's important to think about. And also, I think we find, not to get too political, but even thinking about in this election, a lot of Black men voted for Donald Trump. And so what does that mean? Is that pertaining to masculinity? Do you feel like your economic independence is tied to Donald Trump being president? And is that masculinity, having money? And if so, what does that mean? Black women don't get to do that. We don't get to say, well, we have a lot of money, so our outcomes are better, because they're not. Black women with money are still dying in childbirth. It doesn't matter if you're educated, you have money, like we still have bad outcomes no matter what we have, education or money. So I just think it's different. And I think those are conversations that we need to have more often.
Yeah, thank you. This is really great. And there's a whole chapter on Black women's roles in co-ops coming up in a couple of chapters. So we'll get to talk about that again. But I do like the focus that Imhotep gave us about the patriarchy, right, that it's patriarchy, right, that we need to worry about, and how men can reconfigure, re-understand their roles. But the other thing I do want to point out, if you actually tried to count sort of who are the main names that I cover in the book, there's probably still more Black men that I'm able to name in the co-op movement than Black women. So it's no one saying that the Black men have no role or played no role, right? If you look at the main quotes that I give you, most of them are Black men, right? Du Bois, A. Philip Randolph, Schuyler, et cetera, et cetera. So it's not that Black men don't have a role in this, and I wasn't trying to underplay that role. What I was trying to do, and actually some of the Black men said it, was to show that there was actually a strong role for Black women, which is not usually recognized or recognizable. So that's really right. So I wasn't trying to undermine the role for Black men, and I wasn't trying to say that Black men weren't leaders here, because they're very important to the movement, but equally, right? And that's also one of the quotes from Ella Baker, is bringing women equally, right, to an equal status. And so it's interesting that in the 30s, she was actually, giving speeches about that, as well as writing about it in the newsletters and stuff. But then there are people, you'll see when we get to the Gary, Indiana group that we talked a little bit about with education, but we'll talk about them more next week, I think, when we talk about the other 1930s co-ops. He says the Women's Guild, the women were the ones that held their organization together. So he, a man, and if you don't know Jacob Reddick, he actually goes on after that to become president of Jackson State University for about 16 years. So he's a highly recognized man. He almost was actually the first director of the co-op, the self-help co-op division of the Department of Commerce under FDR's administration in the late 30s, but the day that he was going to accept FDR's appointment, he got appointed as president of Jackson State and moved from Gary, Indiana to Jackson, Mississippi, and becomes president there. So it was just really interesting to me that it was not just me noticing that there were this women role for women's leadership in this movement, but also that the Black men were recognizing it all as well. So I think, we can talk some more about that when we get to that chapter. The other thing that's really fascinating to me about this period, and as I said, again, the next chapter is also about a lot more co-ops in the 1930s. So there's again that tension, right? In some ways, and some of the co-ops don't last long because they're in the Depression and people just don't have enough money to put in the dues or whatever. But also some co-ops started and thrived because of the Depression, because people had nothing else. They had to do something to survive. And so they were able to put together even pennies in order to be in a co-op, to get some food, to get some gas, et cetera. So you'll see in the next chapter, but also when I talk about the periods of most prolific Black co-ops, it was the 1880s, which we went through already, the 1930s and 40s, I found the most co-ops, and then the 60s and 70s, I found the most co-ops. So often it's not, the Depression is not the thing that stops a co-op, but is actually the thing that encourages cooperation, because people have almost no other way to survive. But then if things get a little better, or sometimes we saw if things get even worse, right? But even the Buffalo co-op actually lasts 30 years or some version of it, right? They have a store, then they've had a year or so where it didn't work and they had to regroup, and they regroup and they have another store, and then they have to fix that store, and then they have some people who keep it alive in the 60s or whatever. But it basically, they had for 30 years, they had a Black owned co-op store and a co-op society that was doing co-op education and a variety of other co-op stuff. So that's actually, the Buffalo example is one of the longest lasting examples we have, even though they struggled in different stages and for different reasons. So that's, again, another thing that it's interesting to me, is that was a good example where I actually had the data to show how it kept reinventing itself and kept moving and kept being alive in that community, and the different ways that people kept it alive. And the last thing to say about the Depression, as I said, we'll talk about it more next time. But the other thing that was really fascinating to me was, so remember, the Depression starts in 1929, right, with the crash. And then 30, 31, 32 are some of the worst years, right? Then some of the New Deal policies kick in, and you get some relief slowly, but I think there's another bad turn, and then you have what's called the second New Deal. But anyway, the Young Negroes Cooperative League comes in right there, 1930, right at the worst moment, right? And in a year, they have their first conference in 1931, October 1931, so almost 90 years ago, 89 years ago. And I was shocked at this number. They had 30 delegates and 600 participants. So October 1931, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, over 600 Blacks come together to talk specifically about cooperative economics. Just imagine, think about that. In my over 20 years in this movement, I have never been at a conference or a meeting that had 600 Black people talking about co-ops. In fact, I've almost never been at a co-op meeting that's had 600 Black people. 600 people at a co-op meeting. But I've never been anywhere that's had more than maybe 100, 200 Black folks talking about co-ops. And this is the height, right? This is the beginning of the organization, the height of the Depression. People traveled to Pittsburgh to come to a meeting, right? And mostly young people, right? So even that, even if they never did anything else, that's an incredible feat, right? And not only are they doing that, but Ella Baker is making her speech about importance of women being equal to men and connecting with housewife leagues and everything to make the movement stronger. And so they're having real conversations about really important issues and cutting edge issues, right? The second year, they have a similar conference, not as many people attend, but at Howard University in Washington, D.C. in 1932. They have another conference. They bring in the big wigs, some of the Howard professors and other scholars come to that one and talk. And again, they're talking about how to bring in more people and bring in youth and how to strengthen the movement and why co-op education is so important. So really fascinating ways that they were engaging people, even though they couldn't collect enough dues to pay their rent in Harlem after 3 years, right? But they're still engaging. People are talking, they're getting scholars talking to ordinary people, young people coming, women feeling empowered and connected, right? So it's really a fascinating organization from that side. And then the last thing I wanted to remind us of is their plan, right? What was their plan? Their plan was to start small and build big, right? So they were supposed to start with organizing local people into a council or a chapter, right? They were supposed to start a buying club. She was like, if you have $20 a week to buy food for your family, what if you put 10 of those dollars into a buying club? So you could buy in bulk with other people. Everybody puts in their $10. You have enough money to buy all the food you possibly could need in a week and still have some of your grocery money left over, right? Use the buying club for a while. And then if it's, if it goes well, you could make that into a co-op store, right? You could have a couple join with a couple other co-op stores or in the neighboring neighborhoods, right? Create a council of co-ops from there, right? Then start a credit union because all you need a place to save your money as well as to get your food, right? Then start a regional co-op organization under the guise of the Young Negroes Cooperative League. Start regional factories to support the stores and stuff that you already have in each of your neighborhoods. And you use the Young Negroes Cooperative League as the national organizing group to help do the education, help you with how to develop your co-op, et cetera, et cetera. She had everybody, if you just put in $1 a year, if we had 5,000 people putting in $1 a year, there'd be $5,000 for the national, right? And then everybody could do their locals however they needed to. So she had a well-defined program for how things could build, right? You could sort of build what we now call ecosystems and structures and how you could start small. She understood, right, that money was a problem. That's why she was like, just use half of your grocery money, and see where it goes. That kind of thing. She had another plan, a penny a day plan for everyone to put in a penny for the first 3 months of the year to co-op development, and then all the Black organizations to charge a penny for all the major programming they had for Emancipation Day and Black History Week and Lincoln's birthday and whatever, any plans, she wanted all the major Black organizations, whenever they had an event, to charge an extra penny that would go to co-op development. Unfortunately, nobody signed on to those things, but she had a lot of great ideas for how everything would be doable. I think that's the thing that was really exciting to me, that she put everything into tiny pieces so it was all doable. You didn't have to think, you had to know sort of the final vision, but you just had to do these incremental things that were doable, everyday doable, and work together, and that you could get somewhere. I still think that's a good plan, and I guess we could spend the last 5 minutes. What do you all think about that plan? And do you think it's doable now?
Well, I had a quick question for you. I was thinking about everything that you said. By the way, you're so smart. So
Thank you.
So
I tried.
Yeah. So I was thinking about, because you said Baker, well, in your book you said Baker leaves to direct the SNCC, right? But it's interesting because that sort of goes away from sort of the principles of what she believed in it, because it seems as if this collective idea is community bound, and SNCC goes into sort of a national way of thinking in terms of integrating Blacks and whites together. So that disappears.
There's a 30-year difference right? She doesn't go to SNCC straight from the Young Negroes Cooperative League. She goes to the another co-op. She becomes education director at Problems Co-op in Harlem. That's the next job after Young Negroes Cooperative League, right? So SNCC is a 30-year, after 30 years of different experiences. I think she did move more. I mean, I think the Young Negroes Cooperative League had that plan of building local to national, but if you look at the trajectory of her career, she then goes into more, well, after she does the one co-op in Harlem, she then does more national organizations, right? The WPA Consumer Education Program is a national government program, then NAACP, she's doing national field director, but she's out in the field all the time. That job is actually doing local organizing for the NAACP, but she's heading the local organizing piece. And then from that, yeah.
Sorry, so because I know that you talked about building a collective community that is sort of steeped in Blackness, that many of the members should probably will be Black, right? And that makes sense to me. But I'm wondering if Ella Jo Baker didn't believe in what you're saying, like if she believed more in the collective concept and it happened to be Black folks, but it might be that she believed in the collective idea, but she wasn't married to the notion that it must be mostly Black folks. Because even though it's 30 years in between, I just wonder.
Yeah, I don't know, because NAACP and SNCC are all Black organizations.
But both are sort of integration, they have this integration kind of concept to their thinking.
Well, when SNCC started, it was not integrationist. That was one of the first big splits in SNCC, right? At first, its name was Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. It was about Black nonviolent activity to demonstrate, right? Then they decided they actually wanted to be nationalist, and they became Student National Coordinating Committee because they had trouble figuring out what the role of white allies were and what the role of nonviolence was. And so they actually said, never mind, we won't worry about white allies and we won't worry about nonviolence. Let's just be a youth nationalist organization. So
thank you.
So even SNCC went through a variety of things, and some SNCC members were actually doing co-op development, like John Lewis. So I don't go into a lot of that in the book because I didn't really study SNCC that much. But actually, when you get to the 60s, you see that some of the SNCC members, even though SNCC had mostly been focused on national politics, they also had, and voting rights, they also had some co-op development stuff they were doing. So it's more, I think it's more complicated, but you're right. She's another one, like we talked about this with Du Bois last time, right? She's another one who kind of laid out this whole vision and then doesn't really follow it the rest of her life, right? She follows pieces of it. But in her case, what my biggest point with her was that she learned so much about organizing. I think she learned so much about that grassroots democratic organizing from the co-op movement. So even though she didn't end up pursuing that whole plan that I just laid out for the rest of her life, she was always involved in co-ops, but then the work that she ended up doing was more national politics, but with that same, she never lost that notion of grassroots leadership, grassroots organizing, right? Leadership development at the grassroots, and that ordinary people should be fighting for their own rights, right? She never lost that. And that's what I'm saying, I think, is what really stuck with her from the co-op movement, that notion of grassroots participation and how important that is for sustaining a movement. But we don't have good, right? Again, she never wrote in a diary, oh, I stopped doing co-ops because it was too this or it was too that, or, we don't know why she didn't pursue it on a larger level. As I said, she was always involved in some kind of co-op, but why she had to give up on the larger pursuit. And right. And we also don't even know why the Young Negroes Cooperative League folded, except that they didn't have enough money to pay her salary and to pay rent. And she kept it going as long as she could out of her own living room. But it's just so long you can do that. So there's, in some ways, this whole book raises more questions than it answers. And I hate to say that. But, I'm thankful and surprised at how much information I found. I didn't even expect to find a book's worth of information when I started. So it's amazing to me that I was able to find enough information to write a book. But it's also a little frustrating that I was never able to find enough information about any one example to really answer all our questions.
I would like to speak to what you first started with about organizations that start small. They're like the Young Negroes League, they had planned to start small. And it's about getting started. It's just, the art of the start. To wait and write for the $1 million grant before you go out and work with the community on an even prototype. And so, but to start and to reach out and have others come, and let's empower ourselves together to do these things, because we can. And so I think that's what I liked so much about all the readings I did in Collective Courage, just to think that people came out of slavery, no 40 acres and a mule. In fact, all of a sudden the mantra became, if we give the people we've just liberated any kind of support for all those years, it'll just make them lazy. So we're not going to give them anything. Yet and still, whole towns were started with just some people saying, let's go over here and make a life for us. So the idea of starting small. And it's not that you have to look at starting small, because you look at the big picture, but you start. And if starting means it's you and one other person, and you go get somebody else, and you start, and you go get somebody else, and somebody else steps up, and you find a place for them. And I think that therein is the harder part with the gentleman who was the writer, Schuyler. To have ideas, wonderful. To start an organization, wonderful. Helping people who step up and say, I want to be a part of this wonderful thing, helping them find what at Kepler, we call it the right place on the bus. And, people always step up and want to volunteer. They do. Oh, hey, this sounds wonderful. I want to do this. And they go and they sit down on a seat on the bus, and very soon that is not their seat. And they decide that this is not their seat. So then there is the management of helping the volunteer helping the funder find the place on the bus. So that's what made the Young Negro League in 3 whole years, were able to encourage those people to go far and do good work. It was something to just get it started and hold it together. And starting small and growing, there's still, since it's a people organization, co-ops are a people organization. And can you get people to sit down and let's talk about it? Let's read and study about it.
I'm sorry. What was the question? I'm thinking, like, what was it? Did you just answer one of the questions on Paulette? I'm not sure because.
Jessica was talking about what do you think about that idea of going into a particular project, saying we're going to start small. The Young Negroes League said they will start small.
Okay.
That's what they said.
Something else. All right, cool, great, thanks.
And in each case, everybody got to be national. SNCC. I'm sure SNCC didn't start and say, okay, we're going to be a national organization. This is Monday, and we got this trajectory by Friday, 2 months from now. But it's those wonderful, but to start, and it's the people organization, and to keep in mind it is a people organization, and we're gonna all get there together. So
that ties into an interesting point that, like, right now, if it's not big and bad, then it's practically worthless. Or I feel like that's a perception that a lot of people have nowadays, that, with things like media getting like millions and sometimes billions of views, social media, everybody's watching you. A lot of the times it can feel like if I don't have 1 million followers, then I don't have a voice here. If my organization isn't big, if my skills aren't to the level that I'm always seeing, then I'm, practically nothing here. I don't contribute anything to this space. So I think it's really about incentivizing people, like you said, just to start, because everybody had a starting place at some point or another.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, you can think globally, but act locally, right? So that works with co-ops too. It acts with sustainability and the environment, right? So you have the broader view, where you're moving toward, but you can start with a small local thing that's doable, that's achievable, and then you move from there. And that to me is one of the lessons. There's certainly a role for big and national, and there's important things that happen at scale. There's important things nationally that you can do with policies and, education and those big conferences that they had. But you still have to start with people where they are and get them to do 1, 2, 3 things and see some success, and they can keep moving, keep pursuing, And the other thing, I don't know who those 600 people were who went to their first conference, but we have to believe they all did something, right? And maybe, people do the research in their own communities, they'll find out, oh, that person actually was in Pittsburgh in 1931 at that conference and did something back here at home. I mean, we don't know. They all had to do something. They must have talked to somebody or said something when they went back home from the conference. Right? It's all part of that history that we've lost, or that's so embedded in everything else that we do that we don't see the connections. So I think, we're way past time. Kenneth?
No, I think it was Alvin who had something.
Oh, Alvin.
Yeah, I just wanted to add in, dittoing that point, that the idea that these are really vehicles for human and communal transformation and the reestablishment of relationships and trust and culture that is rooted in sharing of resources and care for each other that we've been so alienated from. And even if like an organization doesn't last forever, doesn't mean it's not a vehicle for transformation that then leads to the next stage. I mean, I think that maybe it wouldn't be like this idea of transforming the whole economy, because the economy has changed. It's like even that idea of bringing manufacturing back to the US. Like, are we going to manufacture everything that we need in our community? Maybe that's not like realistic given the current economic system. It might get there at some point. But I think there's a lot of like fruitful things that we can do, whether it's around food, this hyper local thing that we could, even if it's not profitable or like something that you can sustain an economic activity on, it's a good social good and a need that we all have that is a vehicle for development of people and skills and relationships with each other. That, and I think also housing is another hyper local kind of resource that we can relocalize, and education and how we care for, well, you actually like the young people and also like seniors and like health people. So
Alvin, I have a question. Where's the profit in all of that? I'm trying to see some money out here. Where's the profit in the human? I'm not really seeing it.
Community well-being, community well-being.